In this video, I will show you my favorite 10 traps in the King's Gambit, and I have been using these traps to trick my opponents and win more games. And you can also use it too. So let's move on to our first trap. So after e4, e5, f4, black declines with bishop c5. This is the classical defense. You play knight f3, developing the knight, d6, and here you play c3, preparing d4. Black goes queen e7, you play d4, takes, and here the best move is to move the bishop back. But the second most common move is queen takes e4. And here you can shock your opponent with king to f2. Now his bishop is under attack, so he moves his bishop back, but this is a big blunder because you can play bishop to b5 check. He cannot play c6 because of rook to e1, which will pin his queen. Therefore, he goes king d8. But then you play rook to e1 anyway, and after black queen's move, you can play rook to e8, checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, black takes this pawn. You play knight f3, g5. This is the best move for black. Bishop c4. Black goes h6, creating this strong pawn chain. Then you play h4, attacking this pawn. f6, defends the pawn. And here you are going to shock your opponent with knight to e5, sacrificing the knight. If it doesn't take the knight, then knight to f7 is coming, therefore you have to take. But then you can play queen to h5 check. King e7 is the only legal move. Then you play queen f7 check. King d6 is the only move. After that you go queen to d5, king e7, and then queen takes e5 is a checkmate. And you just win the game in 10 moves. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, and here more than 1 million people have played f6, which is a big mistake if you know how to punish this move. Here you have to play f takes e5, and after black recaptures, you can play queen h5 check, g6, and then you go queen takes e5, forking the king and the rook. And after queen e7, you can take his rook, and you are completely winning. Then even if here he goes king e7, then you can take this pawn, develop onion pieces, and castle on the king's side, and this king will not last long. So let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, e takes e4. Here you go with the bishop's gambit, bishop c4. White is giving up his right to castle for lead in development. Therefore, after queen s4, king f1, black goes bishop c5, threatening mate in 1. You play d4, attacking the bishop, bishop moves back. Then you play knight f3, attacking the queen. Here, the best move is to go queen to f6. And here the second most common move is queen g4, which is a big mistake because you can play this amazing move, bishop takes f7. If he takes the bishop, then knight to e5 is a royal fork, and you just pin the queen. Therefore here, you have to play king e7, and then you go h3, attacking the queen. Queen g3 is the only good move. Then you play knight to c3, developing the knight. And here, his queen is completely trapped. So after king takes f7, you will go knight to e2, attacking the queen. The only safe square for the queen is queen g6. Then you go knight to e5, forking the king and the queen, and you just win the queen, and you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. So after e4, e5, f4, black takes this pawn, you play knight f3, g5, you play h4, black goes g4, attacking this knight. You go knight to e5, trying to regain this pawn. Knight f6 is the best move by black. Here you go knight takes g4, black takes this pawn, then you go d3, black goes knight to g3, Then you recapture this pawn with the bishop, sacrificing the rook. But before taking the rook, black goes queen to e7. You just block this check with the bishop. If he takes the bishop, then you can recapture with the queen. And after that, you will have a lead in development. But here, if he takes your rook, then you can play bishop to g5. Black goes queen to e6. You play knight to f6 check. King d8 is the only move. And then you go knight to d5, which is a discovered check. f6. You take this pawn. Bishop blocks. You can take this bishop as well. And after king moves, you can take this pawn, forking the king and the queen. And after king takes the bishop, you can take his queen and you are completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, e takes f4, knight f3, bishop e7. We play bishop c4. Black goes bishop to h4 check. You just play g3. And after f takes g3, you just castle on the king side. Black takes this pawn as well. And here, don't take this pawn, instead play king to h1. Here black goes bishop e7. And then you will shock him with this amazing move, bishop takes f7 check. Taking this bishop is kind of forced. And after knight to e5, double check, black goes king e6. Then you go queen g4 check, sacrificing the knight. King takes, and then you go queen f5 check. And after king d6, queen to d5 is a checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, e takes f4, knight f3, bishop e7, bishop c4. Black goes bishop h4 check, king f1. Black goes h6. Then you go d3, opening up this bishop. d6, preventing your knight from jumping to the center. You just regain the pawn, and after bishop e7, you play knight c3, c6, trying to push d5. You play e5. And after black takes this pawn, you can recapture this pawn with the knight. And after bishop e6, you can take this bishop. And after black recaptures, you can go queen to h5 check, g6. Then you can take this pawn, and after king moves, queen to f7 is a checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, black takes, knight f3, black goes d5, striking in the center. You play knight c3, black takes this pawn, and here you recapture with the knight. Black goes bishop g4, pinning your knight to the queen, but you go with this sneaky queen to e2, threatening a discovered attack which will win the bishop. So black goes knight takes f3, but this is a big blunder because you can play knight to f6, which is a double check, checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, black takes, knight f3, bishop e7. You play bishop c4, knight f6, normal move. You play knight c3, knight takes this pawn, with the idea of if you recapture, black can play d5, which will regain the piece. But you ignore this and play knight e5. Black goes bishop h4 check, king f1, and then black takes this knight, hoping that you will recapture with the pawn and then continue to play. But here you will shock him with queen to h5, threatening mate in 1. Black goes g6, but here you shock him with bishop takes f7, and black is completely lost. If king e7, then you can regain the bishop, and his knight will be also hanging, and you will have a great position. And even though here, if you place king to f8, then you can give him a check, and he is forced to move back, and it's again the same position, and you are just completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, black takes, you play knight f3, d6. You play d4, grabbing the center, g5, threatening to push this pawn. You play h4, attacking that pawn, g4. You undevelop your knight, knight f6, knight c3, And black goes knight to h5, trying to move his knight to the g3 square. You're going to prevent that move by playing knight g2, bishop e7, attacking this pawn. But you ignore this and play queen d3, bishop takes h4, king d1. Then black goes c6. You play knight takes f4, and after knight c3, hitting the rook and the bishop, you play rook g1. Black goes f5, striking in the center. You play queen e3, and after black castle, here you can shock him with bishop to c4 check, king h8, but then you can shock him with knight to g6 check, sacrificing the knight. If he doesn't take the knight, then you can play queen h6 check, and it's a mate in a few moves. And here if he takes the knight, then you can play queen to h6, checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, f4, black takes. You play knight f3, bishop e7, d4, grabbing the center, knight f6, repairing to castle. You play knight c3, black goes d5, striking in the center, but you ignore this and play bishop d3, defending this pawn. Black takes and then you recapture with the knight. Knight c6, developing the knight, and here you play bishop takes f4, regaining the pawn. Black takes this pawn, and then you can recapture this with the knight. And after queen takes, this is a big mistake because you can play bishop to b5 check, which is a discovered attack on the queen, and you just win the queen. Well, this is not the end. If you want to learn some more chess traps, then you can check out this left playlist. And if you want to learn some chess openings, then you can check out this right playlist. And if you don't want to miss more amazing videos like these, then don't forget to subscribe.